Okay, so welcome to another webinar of Cardiff University's Transnational Cultural and Visual Studies Research Seminar Series. My name is Dr. Cristina Marinetti, and I am Senior Lecturer in Translation Studies here at Cardiff. And I'm the Director of the MA Programme in Translation. I'm really pleased to be welcoming Katja here today. There is a great affinity between her research and mine. Like Katja, I've always been fascinated by what happens when translation is performed on stage and in everyday life, and how models of performance can help us think about translation as something that we don't just do verbally or in writing, but as something that we actually also embody physically and spatially as individuals and as communities. And I'm currently actually co-editing a special issue of the journal Translation Studies on those very topics, looking at the agents and networks that embody translation in different performance cultures. Yeah. And we're looking, for example, from music to drama, from opera to digital performance. Yeah. Okay. And that's the reason why I'm delighted today to be chairing the webinar and to welcome you to a talk by Dr. Katja Krebs on embodied adaptation and performed translation. Yeah. Katja is a senior lecturer in theatre and performance at the University of Bristol, and her research interests are mainly in areas related to adaptation and translation for performance, but also theatre history and historiography. She's particularly interested in the relationship between translation practice and dramatic tradition, but also translation and adaptation practices, products, and concepts. Some related research interests of Katja's include early 20th century European theatre history, pan-European theatre exchanges, and the investigation of translation as performative practice. Yeah. She was one of the co-founders of the Journal of Adaptation in Film and Performance, and has published widely on 19th and 20th century adaptation and translation in the context of European theatre. Most recently, she has co-edited the Routledge Companion to Adaptation in 2018. Okay. Now, before I hand over to Katja, I would like to note a couple of housekeeping things. Yeah? After Katja has spoken, we will open the floor to questions. Yeah? You can post questions at any time during the webinar by using the Q&A box, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. Yeah? You can also, if you like to do that, vote each other questions, which will give us an indication of which question is the most popular. If you prefer, however, to ask your questions live, yeah, you can do that too at the end of Katja's talk. Yeah. To ask questions live, you will need to use the raise hand feature, which is also at the bottom of your screen. Please don't use the raise hand feature during the talk. This can be only used during the Q&A, okay? And we'll then unmute you to allow you to ask your question live, okay? Now, following the talk, there will also be a short survey, which you're all encouraged to take part in. It will really help us a great deal in terms of planning future event. So if you have a little bit of time, we'd really appreciate if you could take the survey. But that's it from me now, and I hand over to Katja. And thank you again for accepting our invitation. We're absolutely delighted to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here and the very kind introduction. And it's a pleasure to speak to you all, even though I don't see you. I hope, however, that this performance of liveness, this adaptation or translation, if you will, of a research seminar in one of the rooms at Cardiff University will be of interest at least enough to make it worth your while to stare at a screen for another couple of hours of our lives. I'm going to share my screen with you so you can have a little PowerPoint prepared. So let's just start with that. Right. I have been in between subject areas and research groupings for most, if not all, of my professional life. Theatre and translation in a rather monolingual culture, that is the higher education context, and the research environment in England, where I've spent most of my university life, has been interesting to say the least. The English theatre lot never quite knew where to put me, because what does translation matter anyway? And the translation lot were a little dubious about the event that is theatre, the event beyond the written play, the performance of translation, which is as ephemeral as the performance event itself. Now, I then added a third subject area, that of adaptation. And there it started to become just as interesting. Adaptation studies is monolingual as well as monomodal in its own right. Written text to film, ideally in English, is its main concern, and issues of translation get ignored regularly and continuously. While I'm not claiming by any stretch of the imagination that I can solve all or any of these tensions, these frameworks of exclusion, I'm really interested to see what happens at the intersections of theatre and drama, the life event and the text, the intersections of adaptation and translation, now and at various points in history, as these intersections are certainly not static. So maybe it is time to start with the position of the historian, as maybe the least contested, and that is saying something, and able to allow us an entry point into these intersections. Eric Hobsbawm states in his preface to the collection of his reflections upon the theory and practice of history, and I quote, "I believe that without a distinction between what is and what is not so, there can be no history." He argues very strongly and convincingly that historians have a duty to distinguish between fact and fiction. Quote, "The point from which historians must start is the fundamental and absolutely central distinction between established fact and fiction." What this paper and my current work is concerned with is a history of sorts, a history of instances of performance which attempt to make the distinction between fact and fiction impossible, presenting fictions as fact and facts as fiction, and the role adaptation and translation play in this presentation is in some ways the theme of my current work. The instances of performance and adaptation, performance as adaptation, performance of adaptation, and performance of translation I'm interested in all do this to some extent. These instances try and interrupt, interject, and even eradicate the distinction between fact and fiction. In short, they meddle. They meddle with their contemporaneous audience's notion of fact and fiction as well as their own. They intervene in subsequent theatre and performance histories, as well as social histories. And above all, they interfere with our notion of adaptation and translation. There are also simultaneously exceptions to the rule and commonplace. Their audience is complicit and fooled at the same time, and they're difficult to locate, to trace, and to find remnants of. Yet they're also ubiquitous. In other words, what better subject for an investigation of adaptation, translation, of reception of popular entertainment than these quarrelsome and amenable, difficult and compliant, contrary and delightful instances of popular entertainment. Now, these instances of performance are not well-defined occurrences of adaptation and performance or performance of translation. If anything, there's a reluctance and hesitancy on behalf of the theatre historian and the adaptation and translation scholar, the audience even, to consider these instances of performance as straightforward examples of well-defined occurrences of adaptation and translation and performance. It is thus necessary to spend a little time going back to basics. While these instances of performance may be able to question some of our fundamental positions vis-à-vis adaptation and translation and performance, they may also offer some answers which might allow us to conceptualize the triangle or the tetrahedron that is adaptation and translation and performance afresh. Yet before we can pay the necessary detailed attention to these instances of performance, these instances of adaptation and translation, we need to keep ourselves in suspense, and something I'm quite convinced the performers involved would have relished. Suspense with regard to the detail of these performances, their names, their acts, their contexts. In order to assess their contribution to our understanding of adaptation and translation, we first need to consider some of our own fundamental positions. Let's start with some questions. What is a translation? Gideon Turi has answered this already. A translation is everything that is called such. But what is an adaptation? This seems a reasonably straightforward question until one begins to unpick this. Is an adaptation a product or a process? Is an adaptation if no one recognizes it as such? Is it enough to label something an adaptation, or do we actually have to be able to compare it to something that came before it? Is there an a priori category of adaptation, or do we depend on an a posteriori category? Can an adaptation be known to be an adaptation independent of any experience other than the experience of itself? Or can an adaptation be known to be an adaptation only on the basis of the experience of its source? Surely if the former is the case, an adaptation is the norm rather than the exception to the rule. And if it is the latter, then a text could be an adaptation and not an adaptation simultaneously, depending on the position of encounter. Niklas and Baumbach argue that if the recipient does not realize that she is dealing with an adaptation, she will not be able to recognize and thus perceive the adaptation as adaptation. The adaptation as such cannot be activated, is not recognized, and thus in this specific instance does not exist. Discussing the so-called digital turn, Niklas and Baumbach agree that the democratization of adaptation processes further complicate our perception of adaptation, which might contain several sub-forms of adaptations for which we yet lack a term. There is, of course, a difference in the democratization of adaptation processes prompted by the digital turn that Niklas and Baumbach refer to, and which are played out on YouTube channels, fanzines, and the like, and early 20th century popular performance processes and practices. However, I would argue that our perception of adaptation was never, hasn't necessarily been complicated. Instead, it was never straightforward to begin with, even though adaptation studies as a field may have sometimes treated it as such. That's one side for the moment, but one of the many questions we need to ask is, how does considering something as an adaptation or as a translation help us understand our relationship to it? It referring to both the concept of adaptation and the object that is an adaptation for which we yet lack a term. Now, it as well as object bring with it more difficulties and are somewhat inappropriate, as we are not investigating objects, or indeed its at all, but performance. Messy, bodily and sweaty performances. There's a need then to find a different term, one which allows us to embrace the openness of that for which we yet lack a term, and at the same time, one which encapsulates the physicality, the movement of performance. We need a term which is malleable enough to be constructive and precise enough to be helpful. A synonym, a related concept which brings together movement and an inability to name something familiar. We need an unformulated term in order to formulate, frame, and articulate what might be the result of a democratization of an adaptation process in the context of performance. Something on the tip of our tongues, because we have experienced it already, yet can't quite put our fingers on it. And any of you who translate, I'm sure, have encountered that feeling before. Now, this is not the first time I'm trying to think of a more appropriate word. It comes with the territory, I suppose, that process of thinking of a term which might save cumbersome explanation every time I want to say what needs saying. I also try and think of words when I'm lost for them, when I stumble because something familiar has decided to become nebulous, and the alternatives that come to mind don't quite manage to do the job. This happens, of course, when I write as well as when I speak. And it is at those times when none of the terminology, none of the words I can think of manage to come quite close enough, when I can't quite grasp what it is that will do justice to what is so familiar yet not articulated that I am lost for words. It is at those times that words like thingy and whatchamacallit, thingamabob come to mind as placeholders for conceptual and performative insights. In this context, though, neither seem appropriate. The thingy and the whatchamacallit, I quite like them, but they imply something static, an it, rather than a moving body, while the thingamabob seems gendered and too prescriptively masculine. Now, the thesaurus offers me a thingamajig, and somehow thingamajig seems more fitting than either object or it, or adaptations for which we yet lack a term, or any of the other placeholders. Thingamajig has its origins in the 18th century and acknowledges a temporarily forgotten or deliberately overlooked name of a person or thing. Similar to whatchamacallits, thingamajig refers to something which is familiar yet unpredictable. It is comfortable yet irritating. It entails nearness and distance and seems quite apt for our purposes here, not to have to restrict our notion of what an adaptation might be just yet. It also stands in a rich tradition of popular performance in Britain. Nonsense rhymes and popular music, from Edward Lear via Stanley Unwin to the Bonzo Dog Doodah Band and beyond, all of which embrace the playfulness of words in these traditions of popular performance. The thingamajig then names something which is beyond naming, yet inherently temporal. There's hope you might remember soon, if not soon enough. And the word expresses an inability to remember with clarity, and at the same time it suggests movement. It contains jig, which is used to describe a lively dance, as well as a device which is used to maintain the correct positional relationship between a piece of work and the tool, or between parts of work during assembly. The jig then denotes movement, performance as well as process, and importantly, a positional relationship between parts. Thus, it allows us to consider the spatial and temporal, moving and static elements of adaptation and performance of translation. For the time being then, thingamajig as a synonym for adaptation and performance as performance and of performance, or adaptations for which we yet lack a term, engenders a broad and inclusive view of adaptation, which is located at an experiential level rather than a purely theoretical one, and subsequently refers to Linda Hutchins' description of an encounter with adaptation, and I quote, "On an experiential level as well, the conservative comfort of familiarity is countered by the unpredictable pleasure and difference for both creator and audience." Now, taking performance theory as well as Hutchins' emphasis on the experiential as his point of departure, Nico de Kecko questions what he terms adaptation studies' obsession with form. He argues, "The problem as I see it is that we tend to define the processes of adaptation from the standpoint that privileges the products. We consider the production process to be an authentic instance of adaptation only when it results in the kind of text that is an adaptation. Similarly, for reception to be a process of adaptation, we presuppose that the cultural objects being received are already adaptations. If indeed adaptation is an experience, then as I have argued elsewhere, and as de Kecko extends much further, adaptation is first and foremost an act of reception. For an adaptation to become itself, an audience must be there with it, attending to its againness, identifying with a precursor text, bringing to bear the influence of formal, discursive, and categorical markers that frame the adaptation as such. The catch is that by virtue of attending the adaptation, one must not be attending the text it adapts. Attending an adaptation depends on the disappearance of its adapted text. I would even go so far, he argues, as to suggest that adaptation depends on the principle of non-simultaneity. and the impossibility of concurrence, the refusal of an adaptation to coincide with that which it has adapted, allows us to think of adaptation as something other than an object, something other than an archivable item, less as works fixed in their physical forms and more as active engagement with what Rebecca Schneider calls remains. If we follow de Kecko and take adaptation as active engagement with Schneider's notion of remains, our thingamajig as an expression of nearness and distance, presence and absence, might be even more appropriate here. The remains of something on the tip of our tongues are actively engaged with as and through the use of thingamajig. And as such, we also challenge further the claim for simultaneity of adaptation and adapted text, whatever that might be, and we honor its refusal to embrace the antinomy between appearance and disappearance, or presence and absence. Now, claims of simultaneity, or indeed non-simultaneity, do not only emphasize the temporal element of adaptation, the impossibility of co-presence of adaptation and adapted text, but importantly, simultaneity has also a spatial dimension, in that it can manifest itself as a single vista, incorporating different temporalities, if you like. Simultaneity as a vista can be appreciated from a single space, a single viewpoint, yet if adaptation and adapted text are related through the principle of non-simultaneity, then there is no such single vista we can adopt. In other words, not only is the principle of non-simultaneity central to adaptation as it is to translation, so is the multiplicity of vistas. Adaptation and adapted text exist as a multiplicity of vistas rather than as a single viewpoint or position. Arguably, that is the same for translation, a multiplicity of vistas, both in terms of a multiplicity of translations in themselves, options open to translators in the process of translating, and the reception of translations depending on the position of the receiver. So if there's a spatial dimension to the temporality of adaptation and translation, it's non-simultaneity. What does that mean in terms of our location, our own spatial and subsequently temporal relationship to adaptation and translation? Where do we locate ourselves? Or rather, how do we embrace the multiplicity of location necessary? Not only that, but where do we locate the thingamajig within the discipline that is adaptation and translation studies? And what are the consequences of this multiplicity of location and non-simultaneity vis-a-vis notions of authorship, cultures, and reception? Whatever thingamajig we consider to be an adaptation or translation tells us probably more about our understanding of originality and authorship, text and reception, culture and power than we bargained for. In short, it reflects the positionality of our own vista. The single vista in terms of adaptation and adapted text is unattainable. We are always necessarily partial observers. And it is such a multitude of perspectives, the plurality of vistas, the necessity of the partial observer, which makes adaptation of and as performance, as well as the performance of translation, so interesting, I think. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, sorry. Let us return for a moment to current discourse on the vexed relationship between theatre and adaptation. Margarita Lehrer posits that in a theatrical context, the term adaptation is applied to a wide variety of theatrical operations, uses in contexts in which transformations of sort take place. As alluded to already by de Kecko and his use of Schneider, there's an implication here that adaptation and performance, or indeed adaptation and theatre, are very closely related. If transformation is central to any notion of adaptation, then adaptation is inherently theatrical. And adaptation and theatricality have something else in common. We are seeing what we saw before, is Blau's seminal definition of the theatre audience's experience, which emphasizes both reception as well as non-simultaneity. There's an emphasis on the asynchrony of the experience, we are seeing at this moment, at this time, and at this place, something we saw at a different time and in a different place. If we take this to be one of the characteristics of theatre, then adaptations are inherently theatrical, and that both are relentlessly repetitive in their retelling of stories already told, as well as non-simultaneous. Translation is in a similar position. It is the impossibility of simultaneous access which necessitates translation in the first place. Yet we know when we engage with translation as translation, that what has been translated might exist simultaneously elsewhere, yet we have no memory of it or access to it. When we encounter an adaptation as an adaptation, it is the coming together of familiarity and unpredictability. Linda Hutchins says that the adaptive faculty is the ability to repeat without copying, to embed difference in similarity, to be at one's self and other. Rachel Carroll puts it more bluntly when she states that adaptations are perhaps symptomatic of a cultural compulsion to repeat, in which case they mirror what is at the core of performance, restored behavior, representation of the world, and a relentless repetition lacking the exactness of machines, which is Lehre's description of theatre. Relentless repetition lacking exactness seems as good a definition of adaptation as of theatre and performance, and it echoes Linda Hutchins' seminal work on adaptation. She argues that adaptation is repetition without replication, bringing together the comfort of ritual and recognition with the delight of surprise and novelty, which resonates very clearly and audibly, if not necessarily consciously, with Blau's assertion that theatre audiences take pleasure in performance because we are seeing what we saw before. Adaptation, translation, and performance then are displaying some, if possibly not all, of the same core characteristics: relentless repetition which avoids replication and non-simultaneity. Marvin Carlson identifies this as theatre's ghostliness, its sense of return, while Linda Hutchins identifies this as adaptation's ability to be at oneself and other. Hutchins talks about an adaptive faculty, which is the ability to repeat without copying, to embed difference in similarity. And where does that leave our thingamajig? I want to keep coming back to the thingamajig. Our popular performance is adaptation for which we yet lack a term. But before we can reveal the details of these intriguing performances, these thingamajigs, some attention needs to be paid to constructions of history, and theatre history in particular. Now, according to Robert Shimko, there is a too infrequently discussed moment in historiographic work, the unanticipated appearance of some nearly forgotten yet fascinating element of the past that opens up new avenues of inquiry into a given subject. My thingamajig certainly made an unanticipated appearance in some boxes in the archive. While being concerned with something very different, if somewhat related, i.e. the textual translation and adaptation activities of British theatre professionals during the 19th century, I opened uncatalogued boxes containing mainly paper-based documents. I found traces of translation and adaptation activities in the form of contracts between theatres, contracts between authors and translators, annotations of translated scripts in preparation for production, and so forth. There were copyright discussion and letters between individuals involved, as well as legal positions supported by a variety of law firms, which not only stipulated the financial side of translation, but also the timetables of textual and theatrical productions. Translations, it turns out, were at least twice as expensive as adaptations. And it is no surprise then that in the business that was the theatre in London in the 19th century, adaptations as textual practice were widespread and made up a relatively high percentage of theatrical activity. Yet these traces were all textual, paper-based, material documents which were once, if not twice, removed from the physicality of performance, the live body that is necessarily imbricated. Now, alongside the Victoria and Albert Theatre Museum, which is well, it's possibly being closed, I think. Sorry, that's totally by the by. But the main archive I used was the theatre collection at the University of Bristol, which, according to its own mission statement, focuses exclusively on British theatre history and is guided by a desire to preserve a record of theatre in Britain and the southwest of England in particular. Now, the archive is not only by its very nature an indication of and witness to the ways in which performance threatens the terms of captive or discrete remains dictated by the archive, where performance is expected to disappear. The theatre collection can also be seen as an example of the idea of the autonomy of national history, with its exclusive focus on British and English theatre in particular. Yet there are, of course, traces of the transnational in this national archive. The collection's focus and approach to cataloguing may not always make it obvious if it doesn't actively try and hinder the ability to identify the transnational elements within it. But it is not so much the content of the archive and its explicitly national policy, it is the approach to the content that holds within it the possibility of transnational perspective. Pierre-Yves Saunier argues that there's an alternative which rejects the autonomy of national histories as fiction and favors what lies between. The transnational perspective enhances its capacity by adding the history of entanglements between countries to the checklist of national history writing. The entanglements between countries I came across went far beyond textual practices of and legal perspectives on translation and adaptation in the theatre. Yet it is the textual which has seemingly been at the heart of arguably the majority of adaptation and, of course, translation studies. Rachel Carroll states, for example, that all adaptations express or address a desire to return to an original textual encounter. And Thomas Leach posits that definitions of adaptation have tended to concentrate on the relationships, exchanges, and connections between literature and other media. Yet he also observes that contemporary perspectives have significantly layered the dimensions and definitions of adaptation beyond textualities to include industrial, commercial, and technological imperatives, economic and sociological pressures, and the psychological and physical construction of subjectivities and identities. Now, it is the physical construction of subjectivities and identities in the commercial context of 19th and 20th century popular performance that is the focus of my current work, as well as the location spatially and temporally, of the thingamajigs. The popular performance as the location of non-textual adaptation, the location of our thingamajig, both spatially and temporally, needs some contextualization. Just as the commercial theatre of the 19th, 20th, and arguably 21st century is inextricably linked to adaptation, popular performance outside of the confines of the theatre offers examples of adaptation beyond textualities. It also offers an insight into contemporaneous political and ideological positions, contexts, and histories, as well as social structures of class and nation, attitudes to migrant bodies, and colonial structures. This might be the time and space where more detail and precision are necessary. And while this paper so far has raised important issues and problems of perspective, of spatial and temporal positions, vexed questions, and possible contradictions, it has not answered any of them. I don't think that is its job. Having raised all these, and instead of continuing a rather abstract consideration of elements of and approaches to adaptation, translation, their bodily encounters in spatial and temporal frameworks as thingamajigs, we now need to make some time and space for specifics. The thingamajig needs to come out of its non-specificity, needs to come a little closer to the tip of our tongue. I found him in a box quite a few years ago. It was a cream-colored box, not like this one, which contained folders bound together with ribbons, very much like this picture. When you opened the ribbon, a plethora of items appeared in front of you, only the kind, of course, that can be contained in a box, kept safe by a ribbon. Documents, photographs, newspaper cuttings, letters, and the like, all paper-based and all flat, with different shapes and sizes, some with dates on, some without. I wasn't looking for him and I tried to ignore him at first. There were meant to be other folders in this and other boxes which would allow me to find out the relationship between different languages, theatrical cultures, and translation. I should focus on those that contained information about legal structures in place which framed theatre translations prior to the Berne Convention of Copyright. And yes, there were bits of information regarding payment of translators, decisions as to the timetable of translation vis-à-vis a theatre season, contracts, etc. He didn't like being put back. I tried to ignore him. After all, I hadn't looked for him. My aim was to write a history of theatrical exchange through adaptation and translation by offering a number of case studies from different countries. I was looking for common strategies and processes of traveling between theatrical system and contexts. Travel done by translators, adapters, dramaturgs, or performers. Strategies of travel across junctions and intersections are central to such exchanges and encounters that all allow the formation of crossroads. And I found some. London in the late 19th and early 20th centuries saw regular performances in German. Musicians and opera singers traveled back and forth quite frequently. Some settled, became active members of various London communities and contributors to the performing arts scene of the time. Some formed part of an active touring landscape, a landscape which consisted of numerous musicians, singers, performers, whose names are not necessarily mentioned or acknowledged in existing histories of 19th century theatre. Of course, such a landscape isn't flat and unremarkable. Don't get me wrong, I don't mind. I very much like flat landscapes, but there are bumps, hills, mountains even to acknowledge. And in my particular focus, namely travel to and from and exchange within the United Kingdom, there was a very real landscape, including the North Sea Channel. Yet such landscapes of transition are all too often seen as extraneous to national, more fixed and arguably somewhat more reliant landscapes. National histories of 19th century theatre do not acknowledge or recognize even the role that landscapes of transition in terms of travel, encounters, and exchanges between cultures, languages, styles, even play in the construction and maintenance of national performance landscapes. Sometimes histories of individual stars and celebrities do acknowledge the star's contribution to such a landscape of exchange in the shape of traveling texts as well as traveling people, if only as a further confirmation of their significance. Let's leave that to one side, though, as quite a separate inquiry. But what was obvious in the box in the archive was that with instances of translation and adaptation came legal quarrels. And these legal disputes, the bickering and power struggles I expressed on paper and in documents, they meant I could ignore him, the elephant in the box, the body as adaptation, which performs translation a little longer. I found a translator of contracts who also performed as a poodle impersonator in this box. That shut him up for a little while at least, but there came a point when I could ignore him no longer. He seemed omnipresent, his racist adaptation, his colonial performance of translation, and he himself started to pop up all over the place. Chung Ling Soo, aka William Ellsworth Robinson, lived from 1861 to 1918. He was famous as a Chinese magician and best known for his trick of catching marked his British career. The public at large insisted on believing this white American to be Chinese. Robinson was born in New York in 1861, and after an early stage career in the US, he relocated to London in 1905. Adaptation in terms of Robinson's stage persona is twofold. Not only does he present himself to be Chinese and thus adapt Western assumptions of the East, he also adapts the act and the name of Qingling Fu, a Chinese performer who toured the US from 1898 before performing in London himself. Robinson's presentation of self, his performance of cultural identity on and off stage, was so tightly constructed that he even dressed up his female sidekick. I don't know whether you can see him in the picture there, or her rather. His female sidekick, Sue Scene, aka Olive Puss, and Child. And at the height of his fame, he appeared in public with an interpreter at his side at all times, pretending only to speak Mandarin. Of course, Robinson's appearance as Qingling Su, as well as an audience's readiness to accept his adapted body as that of the cultural other, perpetuates the colonial project. Looking at photographs of Robinson, it becomes apparent that this adaptation of the culturally other relies on very specific instances of costume. While makeup plays some part in Robinson's process of adaptation, it is the readiness of an audience to ignore facial features and instead embrace costume as a guarantor of authenticity that is noteworthy here. And it is the audience's readiness to assume authenticity, to assume that adaptation did not occur, that authenticity was presented, which means this adaptation of an imagined other, namely the Chinese magician, this embodied adaptation is really quite close to the paradox of translations, as articulated afresh quite recently by Heidi Kotze. I quote her: "Translation is the territory of paradox. One of the central paradoxes, and one which runs through popular views of translation as much as it has occupied translation theorists, is the notion that a good translation is one where the reader cannot tell that it is a translation. In other words, a translation proves its worth, its value, by rendering its translated nature invisible." Kotze is, of course, not the first to identify this, but she re-articulates Lawrence Venuti's The Translator's Invisibility, which has long discussed the politics of such a position. In Robinson's case, as one of many examples of embodied adaptation and performance, the audience regards his embodied adaptation a good adaptation, more authentic even than its source, and thus here adaptation and translation are really quite close in terms of their reception. There is no desire to return to an original encounter, which Carroll argues is essential to adaptation. There's no pleasure in recognizing difference between source and adaptation. Instead, we witness a paradox of adaptation within a colonial context. As his stage persona, Robinson appeared with the Manchu queue itself intertwined with the Qing dynasty, which imposed this hairstyle on the Han Chinese. This braided hairstyle is specifically male and appears in Western depictions of China as early as the 17th century. We can find them, for example, in paintings of Chinese performers by Johann Nieuwhof. Nieuwhof worked for the Dutch East India Company, and his account of the Dutch embassy to China during the 17th century remained the authority on China and into the mid-19th century for English readers. Western imaginations of the Chinese other are so closely intertwined with this partly shaved and partly braided hair, and Robinson used such a hairstyle as a method of embodied adaptation, translation even, on and off stage. The translator by his side is another intriguing element of Robinson's public performance outside of the confines of the music hall stage. Not much is known about him at all, other than that he was Korean and a versatile performer himself. In public encounters, he would be by Robinson's side and perform the translation of both questions to and answers by Robinson. Robinson's adaptation of the notion of the Chinese magician was deemed more authentic than the Chinese magician this was based upon himself, namely Qingling Fu, who was born in Beijing in 1854 and died in Shanghai in 1922 after touring the US and Europe. There is a complicity on behalf of the audience here, which demonstrates the omnipotent power of colonialism and the ingrained attitude toward the non-white other. Adaptation then becomes an integral part of what Knowles calls the cannibalization of forms without respect for the cultures that produced them, and it participates actively in the West's colonization of the world's cultures and people. Adaptation, Robinson is just one such example of adaptation as translation, and there were, and most likely continue to be, numerous others. As Chang observes in his discussion of the plays The Geisha from 1896 and the subsequent Chinese Honeymoon from 1901, these depictions of Asian characters were very likely informed by the expansion of the British Empire and the complex feelings of patriotism and anxiety that were associated with this imperial expansion. Adaptation as translation in these cases need to be understood as displays of colonialism and colonist attitudes, which combine patriotism with an enacted and racist display of the other. Such display of colonial attitudes on behalf of the audience as well as the performer, some argue, culminates in the performances such as that of the Chinese magician in the music hall in the early 20th century. Yet I am sure we continue to see such embodied and performed colonist attitudes to this day, and both adaptation as and the performance of translation have been made complicit all too often in the continual re-establishment of cultural superiority on behalf of a former colonial power. And this is where I'll stop. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Katja, for a really, really wide-ranging presentation that is both kind of theoretically enriching and beautifully material. I absolutely adore the picture that you had of the actual box. Was that the actual box that you found in the
Yeah, it's a different box, unfortunately. The actual box where I found him in, it is in a different location now, near a vet's place, and I can't get to it at the moment because of lockdown. So but it's a similar box that I opened.
There you go. I think it's wonderful, and we should really do more of that as scholars. You know, show the process and embodiment of our own research as well, because it really influences the way in which we interpret, especially performances and translations.
Absolutely.
Of the past. I mean, you were talking about multiple vistas. Obviously, you know, and I found that a fascinating way of thinking about translation, thinking about the different vistas that it brings, both translation, adaptation, and performance, that it brings to our thinking about the other. But I obviously don't want to monopolize the discussion here. I could spend hours asking questions and talking about this, but I want to open it up to our participants here. So if anyone has a question, please feel free to pop it in the question and answer box, or alternatively, if you'd like to actually ask your question live to Katja. And we were talking about earlier the fact that we actually miss being in a physical space with physical people asking questions. You know, obviously we're used to these talking heads through Zoom, but we much prefer being with physical people. So if you want to raise your hand, I'll unmute you and you can ask your question. Okay. Well, perhaps I'll give attendees a couple of minutes to think about that.
Absolutely. I'm so sorry, it was a little dense. There was so much in it. I never know when to stop. It's difficult to unpick it because it's such a kind of like a spider's web.
But I can also see that you're doing a lot of theorizing here.
Yes.
And I can see that you're in the midst of really creating something new in the looking at the boundaries between translation, adaptation, and performance, and it's inherent in that kind of theorization, that density, but it's a productive density.
I hope so. It's sometimes a bit mind-boggling, but then the particularities help to bring you back and rummage through boxes.
And the case studies, obviously.
And
yeah.
the case studies, yes.
As soon as you, in a sense, embody your discussion with, with the experiences of this particular adapter stroke translator stroke performer, I think it made it very real to people.
And if people need a bit more time to think about it, he died in such an unbelievable way, and nobody. And if you want, there's a Boris Karloff documentary about him on YouTube. So if he is interested, I'll send a link. But somebody changed the bullets in his fake gun, and he was killed on stage by. But nobody quite knows. It was never solved who changed the bullets.
I see.
Wife who shot him, whether it was some competitor, some other magician, whether it was just a stupid accident. But yeah, so he and everybody in the audience thought it was part of the performance.
Oh goodness.
For a while.
Yeah.
And then he was rushed away from the theatre, and he died not long after.
Goodness.
So he is fascinating. Sorry.
Yeah, that is quite an
information you find in the archive that you want to put somewhere.
And how many kind of foreign performers were actually on the stage at that time? That's one of the questions.
In the music hall, there were a lot of people pretending to be foreign rather than foreign themselves. So there were a lot of English performers pretending to be French. There were, especially for risque songs, it helped if you put on a French accent.
Of course.
And then there were stereotypes of Germans, and there were jokes enacted about German, this, that, and the other. But they tended to, it's quite difficult sometimes to find out the nationalities of these performers because they are not easily traceable.
Oh, I can imagine. It's a little bit.
I don't know whether they pretended to be French and German, or whether they happened to be French and German living in the UK. Or it's interesting. Italians also, they liked to have as part of the kind of standard evening show that went, because you had the famous musical song, then you have the sketches and this, that, and the other, and it is in those sketches that you the different nationalities.
Well, and this was also a time, actually, if you talk about Italian theatre, when Italian theatre companies were actually touring the UK quite extensively. Tori, for example, and Duse were frequenting the royal theatres frequently. So we had authentic, as in, obviously in inverted commas.
And then there was, I mean, people like Elena Duse and Sarah Bernard, so famous in London, that you then have piss takes, for want of a better term, in the music hall of those kind of performances. So there would be ironic pretending to be Elena Duse or pretending to be Sarah Bernard as part of the musical performances.
Yes.
And sometimes more straight copies, especially in the regions, because in London it was fine. You go to the theatre, you go to the musical, it's all on your doorstep. If you live in York or in Sheffield or in Leeds, it's not quite so easy. So there you then have copies of these translations, copies of the plays, kind of shrunk to 10-minute slots so that they could fit into an evening in the halls. And you get some sort of access to it then.
As an after show or something like that. Yeah. Okay, we do have our first question. Excellent, from Yude. Thank you for the very enlightening talk by connecting translation and adaptation in such a constructive way. There is a term, transadaptation, which suggests a blurring of boundaries between the two disciplines. Would you please enlighten me more on the term?
Yes, that term has come, I think, from Canada. There are, it's come from a context where you have a kind of bilingual French-English theatre scene, where you are, adaptation refers particularly to performance of plays that you're performing not in the language that they've been written in, and the adaptation element of it gives you a bit of, or it's about managing audiences' expectation that what they're seeing is a directorial working with the text that may be very, very different than the actual written down thing. So adaptations or transadaptations have been used to highlight that, especially in bilingual countries, where you come across things in either one or the other language, and you then have directorial input, which really produces a performance which is hardly recognizable as something that relates to the text that has been translated. But it comes from a text that has, where that translation and adaptation happens in the rehearsal process. Yeah. I don't know whether that made it any clearer.
I think it's interesting in relation to theatre translation. In the translation industry, it's also been used, transadaptation, as a term whenever you're doing something more than translation proper.
Although that is quite difficult, isn't it?
It grants you a license to do more than translation proper.
And it's an interesting, this idea of translation proper is interesting, because where's the boundary between a translation proper and the unlicensed bit of translation? And once you, and does it then actually become the labeling of it? Does that mean it's kind of like a quality assurance? Or is it something that pretends nothing else has happened, that you haven't changed anything else? There is something about the naming of things, which is more than just describing the process that we're into producing the thing.
Yeah, and you're quite right when you're saying that there is something in the naming of things that actually conceals more than reveals.
Yes.
And that's why I quite like the facetious way in which you were talking about thingamajigs, because however facetious it is, it does make you realize that we don't actually have terms that can explain 100% what it is that we're doing translation without concealing aspects as well.
Yes. And transadaptation also, it conceals as well as identifies a certain process. So there's always a doubling going on. Yeah. And it also depends who decides what it is, the active agents in the creative production of the translation adaptation, or the publishing house, or the director, or the theatre, or the audience. Who is it that attaches the label? Yeah. And depending on who attaches the label, it can then mean something slightly different. So it's not an easy. There is no easy answer. Because the use of the term itself blurs all sorts of boundaries. It's messy. It's a really messy business.
Yeah, I think if there's one thing that a takeaway point of your talk is definitely that, the porosity of those boundaries. Yeah. And if I can abuse my time, my position, and ask you a question myself, I don't know, are there any other questions? No, I don't think there are. Okay, while we wait for some other questions to come, I will abuse my position and take you back to perhaps the beginning of your talk, when I really like the idea of thinking about translation and adaptation and performance as well as multiple vistas. Yeah, I really like the word vistas. It comes from Italian. I like it because of that, but I also like it because it gives a sense of this multiplicity and how these vistas are partial. And it made me think of, I don't know if you're familiar with Matthew Reynolds' work on translation.
No.
He talks about, I really like his image as well, of translation seen not as a channel, but as a prism, that generates multiple and partial texts. And this is, inherently part of why translation is creative, naturally creative by itself. But I'm wondering when, as I said, I'm really seduced by this idea of translation as multiple vistas, translation as a prism, as a partial interpretation. But sometimes there's a little voice, in my head that it reminds me and make me think of that perhaps if we focus on such multiplicities of vista, don't we perhaps also risk losing sight of the political positioning of translators and adapters, and perhaps also the ethical responsibilities that they have towards those they represent? So in other words, what is the place for ethics in your view of translation and adaptation? I know that's another big question.
Wow, that is a big question. Well, the two can't be without each other. You can't do a translation without considering the ethics of it, of both, but also you can't at all point as a translator. Your decisions are at the end of the day not linguistic decisions, but they are ethical decisions in what it is that you are deciding to leave in, to leave out, to change, to not do, to follow the publisher who gives you, I don't know, 10,000 words less because it has to fit into whatever format the publishing house wants. Those are not just practical positions. They are practical decisions. They are ethical by implication. Because you are always, whoever looks at the translations, they're always regarded as honest. No, they're not. But there is an assumption that if you call something a translation, that there is a trust, a contract of trust established, and because of that contract of trust, everything you do as a translator has an ethical implication. And that's, I think, where, as a historian, it's really interesting to look at translations which pretend to have this contract of trust and then break it. But the person who, the people who engage with the translation, they don't even consider that might be the case, that contract might have been broken. There is, as soon as you call something a translation, that you're making an ethical, you're assuming an ethical position where you are implying that you're being honest, that you're being truthful, that you're being open to other perspectives. But that may not actually be the case. That may not be the case, but you are, it's the labeling of something as a translation that does that. Mona Baker's work, I think, is very much engaged in that, in very real terms, in the functionality of translation in politics and the political elements of it. So her position is very important in any considerations of kind of the ethics of translation. I know I lost my thread. Where were we?
No, that's fine. You were talking about the fact that it's not necessarily mutually exclusive, talking about multiple vistas and championing the.
But the multiplicity of vistas is interesting because the multiplicity of vistas is only possible through a prism. If you're standing on if I climb onto my roof and have a look, I can't have a multiplicity of vistas. I can only have one vista. I use something to look through where suddenly the vista multiplies. So, and in a way, translation and adaptation can act as that kind of prism, that they can give you a multiplicity of vista, which you can't otherwise have. But then you have to trust that prism isn't clouded in any way. Do you know what it is? And that's where it gets difficult.
And also you have to look at the different agencies at play.
You do have to,
different individuals who are actually intervening in the shaping of those translation. And
there's a lot of intervention in the shaping of translation, and a lot of intervention in the way translation is performed and presented, and the way in which it is related to adaptation.
But that's what I found fascinating, your case studies. How you could actually see translation embodied in the physical features of ethnical features, dress, hairstyle of an individual. That is truly the embodiment of translation, and it is translation in itself.
And there is an ethical element to this too, because I really like it was terrible. I found the boss, I got quite excited by finding this person, and I quite liked him, and then I thought, no, he did awful things. He it's like, this is like blackface, just yellow facing. This is, there is very much that, and there are, I suppose, maybe this idea of black facing and yellow facing is something that certain translations do that too. They're blackface. The translation is as if it's a yellow. I don't know whether we can think this through or not, but depending where you are, and that's where Mona Baker comes in again, which position you hold. But and there was a strange way I had to assess my own position, because I was so fascinated by this person. He obvious, he was this competition with a real Chinese person, Chung Ling Su. They were meant to meet in London at a certain time and place to have this magician's playoff, so that the audience could decide who was the best in this, that, and the other. And the Robertson, he did really well he did some really weird schemes to stop the real Chinese person to turn up. He was there then and say, oh, look at me, I'm obviously real and he's obviously not, and blah, blah, blah. So there were some really schemes, kind of public, schemes going on to turn it, and it was over all the newspapers. It was a big deal. It was in all the gossip magazines and that kind of stuff. And at the same time, I find him really intriguing. But also, I think, oh God, what does that make me if I find this so interesting? No, do you know what I mean? There is that ethical position you as a researcher take vis-a-vis the box, vis-a-vis what you find in there, vis-a-vis you get excited about studying something, which is not necessarily a nice thing to study.
But sometimes those are the most revealing, because historically they're very impactful.
And it is necessary to do, because there is certainly an translation studies has moved on from there. It used to be like that a bit more in translation studies, but in adaptation studies there is a real reluctance to engage with that difficulty. Still, but they're a little bit younger than translation studies, so maybe in a few years' time, but there is still a kind of very Anglo-American emphasis on the Anglo-American, emphasis on literature to film, and a real reluctance in engaging with the ethics of adaptation.
That's fascinating, and certainly something that I look forward to reading about, especially if you write it.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Katja.
We have an absolute pleasure.
It's been a pleasure to have you, to catch up with you, to see you. It's been absolutely wonderful. There are a couple of things that I wanted to remind our audience of. Sorry, I can't find the beautiful PowerPoint that Abdel prepared for me, and then I meant to share at this point. Here it is. Okay. So thank you very much, Katja, for your talk today, and for engaging so wonderfully with translation, but also a number of other concepts that are so important for our study of translation. I want to remind our audience of our upcoming events. We have talks in April by Dr. Karin Hunter and Dr. Kasia Zimanska. Okay, and if you want to be reminded of these talks, please follow us on our Twitter handles, and we'll be sending reminders closer to the time. And one final thing before I say goodbye to Katja and to you all, if you could complete the survey about what kind of thing you'd like us to cover in the future in terms of talks, that would be really, really helpful in planning our research seminars for next year. And well, again, thank you very much, Katja. It's been absolutely wonderful to see you.
Thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure. And I would love to come along to one of your other events. So I might just... Oh,
that'd be brilliant. It'd be brilliant to see you. And hopefully we'll be able to, welcome you in person when we're able to.
That would be lovely. That would... Yes, and thank you all of you who listened. So thank you very much.
Okay, wonderful. Have a great afternoon, everyone.
Thank you.